They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to disappear. My name is Margaret Hayes, and at 72 years old, I learned that the art of war isn't always fought with weapons. Sometimes it's fought with patience, wisdom, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own worth. The morning of my husband's funeral, I watched my daughter-in-law Rebecca glide through the church like she owned it. She wore designer black, of course, greeting our business partners with the practiced smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment. My son Thomas stood beside her, his shoulders hunched in that way they'd been since he was a boy, afraid of disappointing anyone. But it wasn't disappointment I saw in his eyes anymore. It was guilt. I sat in the front pew, my hands folded in my lap, watching this performance with the detached curiosity of someone studying a particularly interesting insect. Rebecca had always been calculating, but grief has a way of stripping away pretenses. And what I saw that day was raw ambition, dressed in mourning clothes. She moved from person to person, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear those carefully chosen words about continuity and fresh leadership. After the service, as people filtered out offering their condolences, Rebecca approached me with that sugar-sweet tone she reserved for moments when she needed something. Her words were soft, but the message was clear as crystal. The house needed new energy, she said. Perhaps it was time for me to consider other living arrangements. After all, Thomas and she could better manage everything now. The way she said it, with that practiced sympathy, made my skin crawl. But I simply nodded and squeezed her hand, watching confusion flicker across her face at my lack of resistance. The will reading that afternoon felt like theater. Our family attorney, David Martinez, had been with us for 30 years. He'd watched Thomas grow up, had dinner at our table countless times, knew every detail of how Robert and I had built Hayes Industries from nothing. The preliminary will he read gave Rebecca and Thomas exactly what they expected: the house, the cars, a generous trust fund. Rebecca's smile was barely contained, and Thomas actually relaxed for the first time in months. What they didn't know was that Robert and I had learned long ago never to show all our cards at once. That evening, I returned home to find my key card deactivated. Thomas answered the door, his face a mask of manufactured concern. He stumbled through an explanation about how Rebecca thought I needed rest, how they could handle everything now. The words came out rehearsed, like he'd practiced them in the mirror. I looked into my son's eyes and saw a stranger, someone who had chosen comfort over courage, convenience over character. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply turned and walked away, hearing the door close behind me with a finality that echoed through my chest. The next few weeks unfolded exactly as I'd expected. Rebecca wasted no time in redecorating, throwing out 40 years of memories like they were garage sale leftovers. She hired a public relations firm to reshape our family narrative, painting herself as the dynamic force behind Hayes Industries, while reducing me to a footnote, the devoted wife who had enjoyed the fruits of her husband's labor. The photos in the business journals showed Rebecca at board meetings I'd actually run, standing in offices where I'd made the decisions that saved our company during the 2008 crisis. Meanwhile, Rebecca's brother Marcus presented his latest get-rich-quick scheme, some cryptocurrency venture that needed just $20 million in startup capital. It was the same pattern I'd watched play out for years. Marcus would appear with a business plan that existed mostly on napkins and dreams. Rebecca would advocate for family loyalty, and Thomas would cave to avoid conflict. But this time, they thought they had unlimited access to our accounts. They were wrong. The morning I activated what Robert and I had called our Phoenix Protocol, I felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced in years. One phone call to David Martinez. One code word that Robert and I had established decades earlier. And suddenly, every account, every asset, every financial instrument connected to Hayes Industries was frozen pending resolution of what our legal documents termed succession disputes. The 1985 co-founder agreement that Rebecca had dismissed as ancient history suddenly became very relevant. The document clearly established that I owned 51% of all voting shares, a detail that had been carefully obscured in our day-to-day operations but never legally changed. Robert and I had always presented a united front. But the paperwork told a different story, one that protected both of us and the company we'd built together. I learned about Rebecca's first encounter with frozen credit cards from David Martinez, who couldn't quite hide his amusement when he called to report it. She'd been at Bergdorf Goodman. Naturally, when her American Express was declined. The phone call to the bank that followed had apparently been quite memorable, involving several creative combinations of profanity and threats that impressed even the jaded customer service representative. The emergency board meeting Rebecca called for the following Monday was everything I'd hoped it would be. I let Thomas and Rebecca present their vision for Hayes Industries first, a presentation heavy on buzzwords and light on actual business strategy. They talked about disruption and innovation, while completely ignoring the foundational relationships that had sustained our company through 4 decades of economic ups and downs. When they finished, I stood up from the chair I'd occupied at every board meeting since 1985 and walked to the head of the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply opened the folder I'd brought and began placing documents on the table, copies of the original incorporation papers, the bank records showing my personal guarantee that had saved the company during the financial crisis, the patents filed in my name, the client contracts I'd personally negotiated. The room fell silent as I spoke about the difference between inheritance and legacy, between owning something and building it. I talked about the nights Robert and I had spent at the kitchen table, planning and dreaming and working until our eyes burned. I reminded them of the risks we'd taken, the failures we'd survived, the success we'd earned through decades of careful decision-making and genuine relationships. When I mentioned Marcus's cryptocurrency scheme and the emails I'd recovered, showing their plan to drain company funds, Thomas actually went pale. Rebecca tried to bluster. But the evidence was damning. Detailed communications about using company money for personal ventures. Discussions about sidelining board members who might ask difficult questions. Plans to restructure the business in ways that would benefit them at the expense of our employees and clients. Frank Morrison, our longest-serving board member, stood up and formally moved to restore full operational control to me. The vote was unanimous, with Thomas abstaining and Rebecca storming out in a fury that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so predictably childish. The final will reading 2 days later felt like the conclusion of a very long chess game. Robert's actual final wishes were nothing like the preliminary document we'd shared weeks earlier. That had been what he called his canary trap, a way to see who could be trusted and who would reveal their true nature when they thought no one was watching. The real will left Thomas a trust fund that would ensure his comfort but not his control, along with a letter from his father expressing hope that he might someday find the courage to become the man we'd raised him to be, rather than the man his wife wanted him to be. For Rebecca, Robert had left exactly $1 and a leather-bound copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, inscribed with a note that read, "Ambition without wisdom is merely arrogance in expensive clothing." Everything else, the company, the house, the investments, the future, too, stayed with me. The final confrontation came not in a courtroom, but in a phone call that David Martinez put on speaker at my request. Marcus, apparently unaware that he was being recorded, launched into a panicked rant about the cryptocurrency deal falling apart and investors demanding their money back. In his desperation, he revealed the entire scheme, how Rebecca had promised him access to Hayes Industries' capital, how they'd planned to use the company as collateral for his ventures, how the whole family restructuring had been designed to give them control over resources they'd never earned. Rebecca's threats to fight the will crumbled when faced with potential fraud charges. I offered them a choice: accept exile from New York and the Hayes name in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution, or roll the dice with a jury who would hear recordings of their own words. They chose exile. 6 months later, I sat in the boardroom of Hayes Industries, wearing the red suit I'd bought for my 70th birthday, but had never had the courage to wear. The board had just approved the establishment of the Hayes Foundation for Women Entrepreneurs, a legacy project that would outlive us all. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Manhattan stretching toward the horizon. Full of possibilities I was only beginning to explore. People often ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to Thomas and Rebecca. The truth is more complicated than guilt or satisfaction. I feel the sadness that comes with watching someone you love choose the easy path over the right one. I feel the relief that comes from finally setting down a burden you didn't realize you were carrying. Mostly, I feel the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. Thomas calls sometimes, usually late at night when Rebecca isn't around. We talk about weather and news and anything except the choices that led us here. I hope someday he'll find his way back to the person he used to be. But I've learned that you can't save people from themselves. You can only save yourself and hope that your example might light a path for others to follow. The foundation has already funded 12 women-owned businesses. And we're just getting started. Every check we write, every entrepreneur we mentor, every barrier we help break down is proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply building something beautiful from the ashes of what others tried to destroy. I keep Robert's wedding ring in a small velvet box on my desk. Not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of partnership at its best. Two people who trusted each other enough to build something together, and wise enough to protect it from those who would tear it down. He used to say that respect isn't given. It's earned. I spent too many years trying to give away what I should have been demanding all along. At 72, I'm not the woman I was at 40 or even 60. I'm stronger, clearer, more certain of what matters and what doesn't. I've learned that kindness doesn't require weakness, that strength doesn't require cruelty, and that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear when others expect you to fade away. The house is quiet now, filled with art and books and music that reflect my choices rather than compromises made for the sake of keeping peace. I have dinners with friends who value my mind as much as my checkbook, travel to places I'd always wanted to see, and sleep soundly, knowing that everything I worked for is safe in hands that earned the right to hold it. This isn't a story about victory or defeat, heroes or villains. It's a story about recognition, ever Cain, recognizing manipulation, masquerading as love, recognizing your own power when others try to convince you that you don't have any, recognizing the difference between peace and surrender. Most importantly, it's about recognizing that it's never too late to start living the life you deserve, rather than the one others have decided you should accept. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But they're wrong. You can learn to bite back. You just have to remember that you have teeth.